So here's another video for our global age unit on the triangle trade. What I want you to make sure is we already learned about the Columbian Exchange, and I want you to realize that this is something different. The triangle trade was an actual trade of goods. Think of things for a monetary reason. Now, we already learned that the Spanish abolished the encomienda system when Dominican missionaries started to protest it, thinking that the system was abusive. And it was replaced with something called the reparamiento system, and eventually they needed something more to provide the cheap labor to work these newly acquired colonies. So the demand for slaves from Africa then increased so that they could work on all these plantations that were in the New World to harvest things like sugar and tobacco and coffee and things like that. So, what happens now that the slave trade is increasing? Well, why did they acquire slaves from Africa instead of from other parts of the world? Well, when they had natives as slaves, and there were still natives kept as slaves, well into the 1700s, but the natives knew the land, so it was easier for them to escape. They did have, while in small numbers, there were European slaves, often from places like Ireland or Far Eastern Europe in some cases, but they often had a high death rate working in the Caribbean. Africans, however, were immune to most of the European diseases, and it was much more difficult for them to escape. Now, during the Atlantic slave trade, it began to increase in the 1500s, right after exploration, and then quickly increased. The majority of slaves, about 40%, were taken to Brazil. Brazil was actually the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. About 4 million slaves total were taken to Brazil. Spain and Portugal, just like they led the way in exploration, now that they had colonies, they were the first two countries to really export slaves from Africa. But remember, England then took the reins for exploration, and they began to dominate the slave trade as well. About 400,000 of Britain's slaves went to the North American colonies. Now, of course, we know that there were more than 400,000 slaves in total in North America, but remember, their offspring were then slaves as well. About 1.7 million Africans from England, from Africa, but under English control, went to the West Indies. Now, what was the role that Africa played in this? Many African merchants captured slaves within Africa and sold them at port cities to the European traders. On the other hand, many African rulers opposed this, so there was a bit of a discrepancy between the merchants in Africa and the political people of Africa. Now, what's really important that you get away from this video is to understand how the triangle trade worked. Now, there's a few different versions of the triangle trade, but one popular version was that manufactured goods, things that were made, often in factories, think guns, think cloth, they were made in Europe and then taken to West Africa, where the people there would trade other Africans as slaves for those goods. Then those slaves were taken to the Americas. They worked in plantations and they grew things like sugar, coffee, things like that. And that was taken from the Americas to Europe. Now, there are other versions of the triangle trade. One version is to take out Europe and make the trade go from Africa to the West Indies or the Caribbean, and then to the North American colonies. And then the sugar grown in the West Indies was often turned, or molasses grown, taken into rum. Now here you can see the different legs of the different versions of the triangle trade. The first one we talked about is if you follow that yellow arrow down from Europe to Africa, then the pink from Africa to the Caribbean, and then the orange from the Caribbean back to Europe. So you see there it's guns, cloth being brought to Africa in exchange for slaves brought to the Caribbean, and then sugar, molasses, wood taken to Europe from there. And it shows some different versions of the triangle trade as well. Now, the second version of the triangle trade that I mentioned looked more like this, and this became more popular after, a good 100 years after the slave trade even began. So that's when you cut out Europe and the colonies are now more established in the Americas. and the slaves are taken to the Americas. Then things that they make, like molasses, is taken to the North American colonies, New England, most likely, and then brought to Africa in the form of rum. Now, when the Africans left Africa and came to the Americas, that journey was known as the Middle Passage, a voyage of Africans to the Americas. Now, about 20% died during this awful journey. Most historians would say at least 2 million Africans in total died from the Middle Passage. Some estimate those numbers can be as high as 4 million. So as we finish talking about triangle trade, think of how that fits in with what mercantilism is that we talked about. That countries are trying to become more powerful by acquiring more things, and they acquired more land. Once they had more land, you need more labor to work on them. Think of other things we talked about. The Protestant Reformation. How does this fit or not fit with the Protestant Reformation that was going at the time? Does this show a problem? It was the Quakers who were Protestants in the Americas who were the first to speak out against slavery, or known as abolitionists. Does this rub the wrong way with humanism, right? Is it civic humanism to trade and to reach your full potential? Or if you are, hurting one group of people, does that make that all null and void? So the password for today is snowman. Snowman is the password. On your left side, you want to think of the Middle Passage. Think of what it was like being taken out of Africa and being brought to the America on that ship where you're chained and shackled. Bullet 5 points that you think would be awful about that, and then write one paragraph about what you think is the worst part. What one thing would be the ultimate worst part of being taken on the Middle Passage. And then we'll talk about that in class, and we'll see you then. Goodbye.